Good afternoon. I am honored to be here today to participate in this remembrance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I want to extend my congratulations to the young people who you'll hear from later as we celebrate the accomplishments that each of them has achieved today. I arrive at this podium as a result of a lifetime of choices and with a firm belief that where we stand on any given day is a result of the choices that we and others have made. Some choices are obvious and easy, and many are not. I think it's important as we remember Dr. King that we look at his first venture into public life, the first time he came on the horizon for most Americans. By his actions and by his word, he continues to serve as an inspiration for us, and he consistently chose to do the right thing, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was dangerous, and even when the outcome was anything but predictable. And I think in this we see his courage. Yet it is his repeated demonstration of courage that defines him for me. I recently reread Stride Towards Freedom, the Montgomery story, and it is Dr. King's own account of the historic Montgomery bus boycott, which marked his foray as a public figure. When completing his PhD in Boston, Dr. King had been offered a number of pastoral and academic positions in places throughout the country. Yet he and his new bride, Coretta, elected to return to the segregated South of their youth. And despite the challenges and the sacrifices carried with that decision, they felt that they had a moral obligation to return. And so they immersed themselves in Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and in the social and political life of Montgomery, Alabama, not knowing that in little over a year, they would become involved in a boycott of that city's public transportation system. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, and that event was the catalyst for the Montgomery bus boycott. Dr. King not only helped lead the movement, but he led an awakening among those citizens in Montgomery, Alabama, who had become conditioned to segregation and had resigned themselves to its indignities and its oppression. Through their involvement in the movement, they gained self-respect, and as they saw themselves differently, they began to act differently. They elected to walk the streets in dignity rather than ride the buses in humiliation. Courageous men and women and boys and girls conducted a nearly unanimous boycott of the Montgomery, Alabama public transportation system for over a year, withdrawing their cooperation from an evil system. And in December of 1956, Montgomery's buses were officially desegregated by court order. Dr. King was indicted for his role in this event, and his home was bombed. And yet, he persevered. And for the rest of his life, he left the same and the comfortable and chose to stand on the front line of justice, not in his own interest, but in the interest of others. To do what's morally right is always the more difficult choice because it requires personal courage. It's simply harder to do. And yet courage is not the absence of fear, it's the unwillingness, it's the refusal to give in to that fear. And while very few of us will ever be called to lead or even participate in a movement of such magnitude, each of us can choose to engage in small and large acts of courage every day. What does everyday courage look like? My mother, who herself was a product of Alabama's segregated schools, chose to become a tireless advocate for her 4 children to ensure that we had access to quality education. She taught us to respect ourselves and showed us what we could become. My father, at age 20, chose to enroll in the Air Force, and for 40 years, both as a civilian and a soldier, served his country honorably in places like Korea and Vietnam. For 20 years, he wore the uniform of this country, and he also wore it when we traveled south to visit my grandparents, because we couldn't stay in public hotels, and because his feeling was that if our car broke down, he might be treated better since he was a soldier. So there are challenges all around us, in our places of work and in our schools. And by choosing to do what's morally right, courageous men and women, boys and girls can make a difference in our families, in our communities, and maybe even in our world. And in so doing, we can serve as symbols of hope and aspiration. Thank you very much for this opportunity.